Greetings, class. Remember, there's no face-to-face meeting this week. We are in Module 3, Week 6. Remember, last week we started to talk about political cultures and the rise and fall of idealism. We will be meeting again next week when I get back from my conferences. Remember, we started talking about the growth of idealism after World War II. And that it became in some ways a philosophical reason for expanding the Cold War in some ways. And we see this week that in international politics and domestic politics, that idealism was a motivating force in expanding our culture and expanding our diplomatic reach across the globe. Remember, though, that Americans were brand new to the diplomatic scene in 1945 and 46. They emerged alongside the Russians as the power brokers because the traditional ones, the British, the French, the Germans, had been sidelined by World War II. And so we were new to the game in 1945 and 46. Now let's begin with international politics. In some ways, you can see Harry Truman, using Korea as using idealism as a philosophical support for Korea. That by moving into Korea, we could keep it democratic as a democracy. We could make sure it was a domino, that it did not fall. And that overt optimism and that overt sense that we could fix things in ways that were quite naive also motivated Truman, that he would be part of that group of Victorian raised politicians who would see things very naively and very much in black and white terms. The good guys were here, we were going to fix things, therefore it was so. But really, with Dwight D. Eisenhower, you see idealism motivating people in other diplomatic situations. Eisenhower, of course, who was the head of the armed forces during World War II. His vice president, Richard Nixon, also served in World War II, was a congressman, then senator from California, and then became vice president. Eisenhower was the more moderate of the Cold Warriors than Nixon was. Nixon was more associated with the more McCarthy brand of anti-communism. And then with the other Victorian in the staff, John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State. Now, remember that Eisenhower was elected that very easily in 1952. He was the World War II hero, fatherly appearance, but less hawkish. Remember, he'll be less of a war hawk because he'd served in war. Then again, so did Nixon. Dulles would also help him. John Foster Dulles would also help him as Secretary of State. Dulles was a lawyer, tended to be arrogant, aggressive, stubborn, quite averse to compromise. And keep in mind that his brother headed the CIA in this era. Dulles forced many people out of the Foreign Service because of unsubstantiated charges of communism. And there's some whispers that the people he forced out were gay, and that's why he got rid of them. The problem is that many of them were Asian experts who did things like speak the languages of the Asian region. And containment was too defensive for Dulles and eventually for Dwight D. Eisenhower. That in some ways that Dulles wanted every nation to take a side in the life and death Cold War struggle. That's how they would have framed it. Now, remember, there were 125 new countries in the post-war era as the colonial mechanisms collapsed. The first one, of course, would have been India in 1946 and 47, with Mahatma Gandhi and his Satyagraha taking down a colonial power, a vastly weakened colonial power. But that meant that emergent third world needed to be on the right side, that Eisenhower and Dulles wanted that emergent third world to be out and on our team, wearing our uniforms, et cetera, playing the rules by our game. And so you see the nation-building efforts in Iran, in Guatemala, and Cuba, In Iran, for example, the U.S. and the CIA supported the Shah of Iran, who was in power for nearly 25 years, supported through arms and men. Now, we liked the Shah of Iran. The Iranians didn't necessarily like him. He tended to be quite violent. In Cuba, for example, we also put in someone who was sympathetic to Americans, but not so sympathetic to his people, and was eventually overthrown by Fidel Castro in 1959. But it's in this context of nation building, of creating that third world that wasn't going to be a domino that fell to the communists, that they were going to be on the U.S.'s team, that battles in Vietnam began to be fought, that certain events in Vietnam required Eisenhower's attention. And in particular, it was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 between Vietnamese communists and the French colonial power that led eventually to the division of Vietnam. So let's consider this map. On the top, you'll see circled with a star, Dien Bien Phu. The French, who believed with their superior military power, could overthrow the communists who didn't have a lot of guns and bombs, who didn't have uniforms, who didn't have an industrial society. The French believed that they would win any war against the Vietnamese. But what the French did not understand was the rise of nationalism. That while they saw communists coming up the hill, what they really should have seen were nationalists who operated in a system defined by communism as a bureaucracy, not necessarily as a set of beliefs. Remember, communism, at least the way Karl Marx imagined it, it required an industrial system that had that had working class there. What North Vietnam had were peasants and not a lot of industry. And so the better ideological stance to consider is nationalism, because nationalism will motivate people when political ideology will not. Well, it turned out they were the French were pretty naive. And they were garrisoned on top of a hill, and which should have been the prime military location, shooting down on the people below them. What they didn't realize was that there were more troops down there than they suspected, that they were pretty much camouflaged. And in this new Ken Burns Vietnam video, you see them walking up with leaves and branches tucked into their hats so they could crouch down and become part of the forest. And what they didn't consider is that these folks would carry the cannons up that hill on their backs or using oxen. And in the end, at Dien Bien Phu, the French were dislodged, not just from that hill, but from North Vietnam. Now, there was a conference, obviously, to try to figure out what to do with Vietnam. And of course, North Vietnam wanted to be united with South Vietnam. And the Americans said no, because that would have been a domino. And so they divided it at that demilitarized zone area right there in the middle, and that is circled as well. And said, we'll have elections later on. And they put Ngo Dinh in as the main leader. Diem can be credited for dislodging the French from the south as well. And by the time they were gone, he is given credit as getting rid of the French period from French Indochina, its former colonial power. Now, Diem will find out later on that was not a great choice for a leader, but we backed him with money and arms and other policies. Now, at the end of Eisenhower's term in office in 1961, he gave a farewell speech. And that farewell speech at the end of his presidency, it's called the Military-Industrial Complex speech. He argues that we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. And he argued in that speech, in that farewell speech in 1961, that we needed to be exceedingly cautious about that military-industrial complex. Into his place came John F. Kennedy. You'll have listened to a speech by him by this point. He was a young man, a handsome young man, with a beautiful young wife, and they became the image of respectability for the young men and women who had walked out of World War II and into the Ward and June Cleaver image. And I know this because this is a picture of my parents in 1965, June of 1965, and the baby, of course, is me. My parents, my father especially, who had just moved into the middle class, believed that the Kennedys were a model for their own middle class status, newly achieved, and something for that both my parents desired to keep. Now, from JFK's initial inaugural speech, he promised to support any friend, confront any foe. Listen to the speech. Listen to him and that thick Boston accent, and how he imagines the world. But Americans listened to him speak and were enthralled, and they believed that the idealism, that sense that they could change the world, that youthful vigor would cause us to secure our position as world leaders. And we saw this especially in the Peace Corps and the space race. With this Peace Corps, he promised to send Americans, young Americans especially, throughout the world where they could serve in these emergent countries, and perhaps in these developing nations, teach them how to be good in democracy, small d Democrats. One guy said the whole idea was that you could make a difference. I was 16 years old and I believed it. I really believed that I was going to change the world. They initiated this in 1961 with his brother-in-law in charge, Sergeant Shriver. And he, the day they announced it, the White House phones were overwhelmed to the point where they collapsed because everybody wanted to join the Peace Corps. You can also see the space race as being one of those moments in which Americans vested in this ability to, here's a new frontier that we can conquer. And so the space race, which you see some in this great new movie that came out last year, Hidden Figures, was a place where we could reconquer the West. Only the West now is the space, right? All right, but in the midst of this idealism, it caused JFK, who is notoriously idealistic as well, along with his new group of cabinet officers, Bob McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, George Bundy, his National Security Advisor, and the others, the best and brightest, the smartest guys, many of whom had seen wartime World War II service. Bob McNamara sat on Curtis LeMay's staff and was his statistician. He counted missile drops and quantified the destruction of vast portions of Japan. Well, JFK inherited the plans from Eisenhower for the Bay of Pigs disaster in April '61. This is a relatively well-known story. Just keep in mind that what happened was that the CIA, along with Cuban expatriates, wanted to overthrow Castro, who had taken over in 1959 because he was communist. And 60 miles off the coast of America, that's a domino. That's a scary domino. And in what they did is they designed plans in which they would invade the beaches of the Bay of Pigs. They would go into the cities, and in their naive view, Cubans would respond and rise up and just get rid of Castro. That's not what happened. What ended up happening is that those who weren't killed were held as hostage. The U.S. had to pay $35 million in ransom. It made Castro far more popular with his people and far more paranoid. And it ended up to be a black mark on JFK's record. It's that idealism, the belief that people naturally wanted to be small d Democrats. They believed in democracy, and that everyone were genetically geared toward that. And that turned out not to be true. But the paranoia it caused meant that that Castro called on the Russians and asked them to put missiles on Cuba. missiles that were pointed at the United States, which we found in October 1962. And for 13 days, we thought we were going to war. Thankfully, the diplomats stepped in, including Khrushchev and JFK, and there was a warming of relations after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's that context that eventually makes Vietnam possible. That Bay of Pigs disaster, we can't have that happen again. It was humiliating, it was shameful, so we need to make sure that we don't make that mistake again. Always consider Vietnam as part of that trajectory of nation building, of the belief that we could create a stable, solid world if everybody became small d Democrats, and that Vietnam occurs within those decisions. Now, certainly we've talked about international politics and that idealism, the way that spread our reach through the CIA and other mechanisms across the world. There are also domestic examples of idealism where cultural industries that expanded in the 1950s and 1960s would tap into those new domestic spending habits. Remember, the $10 billion teenagers had would be centered in urban areas like Detroit, where Motown emerged, or Nashville, where country music and the Studio B stuff emerged. And these would be sites where cultural ideals like idealism would be negotiated, that we can change the world, we can make it equitable, we can make it a good place where everyone is a citizen. And you see this especially with Motown, that as we transition here into the 1960s, one of the questions we have to ask is, how was Motown part of the civil rights movement? And Berry Gordy, who was in charge of Motown, never wanted to mix politics with economics. And yet you can see, at least superficially, that what Motown did very well was that best expression, that the best and brightest of any race could be economically successful on a broader stage and help define things like respectability, like what who we were as Americans. All right, well, let's begin with the history of Motown. Berry Gordy Sr. moved from Georgia in the 1920s to Detroit when it was discovered he had a lot of money and he needed to leave before he got lynched. The family settled in Detroit and built a very nice middle-class living. Both mother and father worked, lots of kids. I think there were 6 kids, don't quote me. But certainly Berry Gordy Jr. was a recipient of that Booker T. Washington self-help, create your own industries that he learned from his father. He worked for a time in the car manufacturing sector where he saw the assembly line process at work and was very much motivated to apply that process to the culture industry that he created, which was Motown, where respectability, where that belief that middle-class black men and women, particularly young black men and women, could define that sense of change, of potential. The first #1 hit they had was Barrett Strong's Money. Go listen to it on YouTube. It was a hit, but the first #1 song was Shop Around by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. You'll see Smokey Robinson in this picture on the lower left. Smokey Robinson, who went on to have a substantial career with Motown. But what Berry Gordy Jr. did well was apply the assembly line methodology to music making. And what he did is he created an assembly line system. He purchased a theater where he could try out new acts and where those acts could get time on stage and learn how to perform in front of an audience. He created the Motortown Review, where he put his performers in a bus and drove them across the nation performing and selling songs. He created a writing company, a publishing company, so all the publishing rights stayed with what became called Ray-Bar. And then he created a charm school that taught Motown performers how to look and be respectable. Should also mention in here too that he had a set of songwriters, Lamont Dozier Jr. and two others whose names I've just forgotten, who did most of the writing. And he also had a band that did most of the music on the songs. And these guys were the same guys promoting the same music and the same sound over and over again. That's what the assembly line does, is it makes things homogeneous. Everything is the same. And so these other parts of the assembly line made all this possible. And certainly we can talk about Marvin Gaye or Stevie Wonder or the Temptations, but the most obvious one is the Supremes. The Supremes, who grew up in public housing in Detroit, went to a high school with a superb music program, came in with the raw musical skills. And then Berry Gordy Jr. taught them, sent them to charm school, taught them how to walk, how to stand, how to dress, how to look respectable in middle class terms. And then he recognized that the assembly lines, the car assembly lines, were producing a new kind of vehicle, the Ford Mustang, that was being geared toward young men typically, but the '64 Mustang. And what Berry Gordy Jr. did was he got a set of Mustang speakers and he put them in the studio, recording studio, and every song that left Motown as a potential new hit was first heard on those speakers to make sure it sounded good. It's also the rise of FM radio in this era, which was a much more solid sound. It was less you couldn't hear thunder and lightning cracking on the sound. It was a better sound anyway. And so he was able to really cater to that young, emergent middle class group of people like my dad and mom, or who did not have a Mustang too, but a lot of young men, especially 18, 19, 20 years old, who wanted to be modern and cutting edge. And then he found television producers and television hosts like Ed Sullivan, who were willing to put these performers on stage. Ed Sullivan loved the Supremes, had them on a lot, especially loved Diana Ross. And so this became a moment where it seemed that America, as a democracy, if you worked hard, if you looked right, if you sounded the way people wanted to sound, that idealistically, that the changes that the civil rights movement promised, that Dr. King promised in 1963, for example, at the March on Washington, there they were. There was the outcome of that promise on Ed Sullivan's stage, shaking Ed Sullivan's hands. But in the same way, internationally, they found limits to that idealism. They found that nationally, too. And before I move on, please make sure that you go listen to Come See About Me by the Supremes for your primary sources, because that I've given you I've given you a film clip, actually, of them performing that song. And if it doesn't come up, which it might not, just go put in Supremes, Come See About Me, and choose the option for the TV show Shindig. And you'll see how very choreographed, how very controlled, how very middle class they were on these images. Now, we found those limits to idealism nationally as well with the founding of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And this was the college students who decided to break off from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, the older adults organization. And they decided to break off and begin to promote their own ideals, their own idealism through a more direct confrontation with segregation. For them, boycott was not strong enough. What they wanted to do is to apply Mahatma Gandhi's idea of satyagraha more firmly. And that began in February 1961 with the North Carolina AT&T, not the telephone company, but it's an agriculture and technical college, a historically black college in North Carolina. And 4 young men, all black, decided to start doing sit-ins. Those sit-ins spread to Nashville in the spring of 1961. Here's an image of them. And in this, what they wanted to do, this would have been James Lewis, who's now a congressman from Georgia, and Diane Nash, who was a Fisk University student, is they gathered together groups of young men and young women, black and white, very nicely dressed. Again, respectability. This is a middle-class movement. They're wearing cashmere sweater sets, pearls, and the young men in this scene here are dressed in suits. And they would sit in these soda shops and sit there and wait, soda fountains, and sit and wait to be served. Now, one of the people who would go and do these sit-ins was a comedian named Dick Gregory, who just recently died. And Dick Gregory understood something very significant about sit-ins, that humor, as a comedian obviously, that humor would be a way to make sure or to cut the tension. And so the funny story about Dick Gregory at the Nashville sit-ins was that he sat down and the white waitress looked at him and said, "I'm sorry, we don't serve Negroes." And he looked at her and said, "That's okay. I don't eat Negroes." And they found some success here in Nashville, in part because they shut down Nashville's department stores, etc., in the spring of 1961, right around the Easter holiday. Now, I always tease students, Easter used to be the second most commercially successful holiday in the United States. It's been eclipsed by Halloween. But I'll tease my undergraduate students who are going into the ministry, and I'll say to them, will you pull out your Bible, please? And it's the South. There'll be somebody with a Bible in the class. Will you pull out the Bible, please, and show me where it says, "Thou shalt buy oneself a new dress and new Easter bonnet"? And they giggle, whatever. The thing is that before the building of malls, and they started to build malls in the 1960s and 70s with suburbs, most of the shopping occurred downtown. The big, Macy's, what we would know as Macy's and Belk now, would be downtown. And the people from Fisk, American Baptist University, and the Vanderbilt came in and shut down those stores. You'll see that this says fountain closed in interest of public safety. They shut those down right at the height of the Easter shopping season. And not only did they shut down the fountains, because people showed up and put cigarettes out in their heads and dumped ketchup and sugar on their heads. People from outside of Nashville typically, but not exclusively. Everybody else decided they didn't want to come downtown any longer, and it was an issue that had to be fixed quickly. And in this case, they were successful, that they would shut down the downtown, and in negotiations with Bev Briley, who was the mayor at the time, they would be willing to open back up and have integrated city. At the same time, though, these were really violent protests and signaled an increasing violent reaction to this more overt challenge of segregation. And it's that overt challenge that you see with the Freedom Riders, where black and white college students got on to buses that were traveling through the South. So you see they started up in D.C. and ended up in Jackson, Mississippi, where they were all arrested. And that the naivete was that they could ride on these buses and ignore segregation. Nobody black sat in the back. And they would not confront things like exploded buses. James Lewis and Jim Zwerg being beaten to a point where Zwerg is standing on the right there and trying to figure out if he's still got a tooth in that place. When they left May 61, right after the success in Nashville, they boarded 2 buses in D.C., and they were organizing these rides to protest. It's a more direct confrontation, but to protest southern states ignoring an earlier Supreme Court ruling that segregated buses in terminals were unconstitutional because this was interstate travel. And the reporters, again, remember how much the media matters and all of this, were invited to go along. And everything was fine in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. But by the time they got to Anniston, Alabama, the first bus was destroyed. A bus rider was left with brain damage. The second bus went to Birmingham. There were no cops there, even though they had been warned that the bus was coming through. And the white, what they called tough people, took them off the bus and into the alley and beat them. Now, if you go to that Greyhound bus station in the next stop, Montgomery, I believe it is, what it'll say is that the historic marker there said the Klan showed up to beat them up. It wasn't the Klan who showed up. It was everyday, common, ordinary human beings who showed up to stop them. These days, we want to define everyone as a member of the Klan. It wasn't. JFK then sent 400 marshals to Alabama and he was forced to ask for an investigation. The civil rights movement was always dissatisfied, at least SNCC was, with how conservative JFK was. And so the limits of idealism in these freedom riders were very obvious very quickly. Eventually, they got to Jackson where they were arrested. But for JFK, they were too confrontational. And there was too much violence incited in this. And remember, Victorians don't like overt emotions. They don't like extreme emotions. And so they called for a cooling off period, which civil rights worker James Farmer said, blacks have been cooling off for 100 years. If we got any cooler, we'd be in a deep freeze. And so the response was one in which a more radical edge began, not radical edge, but a more confrontational edge began to emerge in SNCC especially. And they would put pressure on SCLC to change their tactics as well, a change that would come out in the Birmingham children's protests. And this ends this lecture.